you. Thank you, Sergey, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, esteemed colleagues. It's such an honor for me to be here with you today. You've put together a terrific program, and I'm honored to be part of it. I'm also humbled to have the opportunity to speak with you, as there are so many other esteemed colleagues who have many important things to say as well. As you know, the special topic of this year's conference is the contributions of higher education to society and economy, global, national, and local perspectives. In my view, improving equity is essential to advancing these contributions. We've heard much about these different contributions of higher education. Clearly, higher education is associated with numerous benefits to individual participants, to our communities, to our states, and to our nations. Data show that recent increases in educational attainment in OECD nations have not created an oversupply of workers. Rather, these increases have been insufficient to meet the demand for skilled workers. Other scholars conclude that a key differentiator of nations that are economically prosperous from nations that are poor is the extent to which a nation promotes the educational attainment of its population. Yet the likelihood of attaining higher education is unequal, and it varies across and within nations. Rather than promoting economic and social mobility, higher education perpetuates inequality in many nations. For the past 20 years, I've conducted research intended to inform understanding of how to improve higher education access and success for people from historically underserved communities and underrepresented populations. The central conclusion that I draw from looking at the work of myself and others is that if we're going to make a difference in improving equity, we need a comprehensive, multifaceted approach. We need actions by public policymakers, and we need actions by leaders of higher education institutions. And this comprehensive approach has to recognize the many systemic, structural barriers that are embedded in our educational systems. I've organized my remarks to address these questions. First, what is the problem? What are the opportunities and challenges of cross-national comparisons? How can conceptual frameworks inform our understanding of how to improve equity? And if our goal is to improve equity, what are the questions that we should be asking to guide the development and implementation of equity-oriented policies and programs? Most of the data and research that I'll present is focused on the US. Nonetheless, I hope the framing of this information is helpful more generally. Before we can identify solutions, you have to understand the problem. I define the problem as having two parts. So first is the assumption that higher education is essential to the well-being of individuals in society, as we've heard. But across and within nations, higher education opportunity and attainment varies across groups. The figure in this slide highlights differences between equality, equity, and liberation. In this example, the opportunity is to watch a baseball game. An equity-oriented approach requires us to recognize that there are differences in the resources that are available to different people. As the first panel shows, providing the same resources to all people does not produce equal outcomes. The second panel shows that providing resources that recognize individual differences can produce equal outcomes. And the third panel that's shown here is called liberation. This suggests the importance of considering the desired outcomes of our policies and practices. More than allowing individuals the opportunity to watch something from behind a fence, as in the first two panels, we should be aiming for strategies that allow everyone to truly engage. Available data and research consistently show the importance of higher education to the well-being of individuals who participate, and for our communities, nations, and states. We've heard some about human capital theory already, and some of my remarks are going to build on what Simon was discussing. So consistent with human capital theory predictions, data for the US show the clear positive relationship between educational attainment and labor market outcomes. This slide shows the premium in earnings that's associated with having at least a bachelor's degree. But given attention in attainment, given the differences in attainment across equity groups, it's important to recognize that individual benefits are going to vary across groups as well. This figure, in my view, also implies some of the societal benefits of higher education. Higher salaries contribute to a higher tax base, resulting in more government revenues. Individuals with more education are also likely to be employed, have better working conditions and better health. They're less likely to be unemployed. And these outcomes translate into less demand for government-provided public welfare services. Increasing higher education attainment is also important for workforce development. As this slide suggests, increasingly available jobs in the U.S. require at least some post-secondary education. These data come from Anthony Carnevale, and he uses data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They estimate that by 2020, only 36% of available jobs in the U.S. will require no more than a high school education. This percentage is down considerably from 1973, when it was 72%. Another way to think about the need for higher education is in terms of the requirements of available jobs. So available jobs in the U.S. are shifting from blue-collar industries like manufacturing, transportation, utilities, and towards skilled services like government, education, healthcare. Additional data in this report show that good jobs, that means well-paying jobs, so good jobs in skilled industries increasingly require a bachelor's degree. Between 1991 and 2016, the number of good jobs in skilled services that require at least a bachelor's degree nearly doubled. And at the same time, the number of good jobs that require less than a bachelor's degree has declined. In short, if the U.S. is to have enough workers with the skills that are required for available jobs, it must close the gaps in higher education attainment. What we know about differences in educational attainment across groups depends on the available data. In his review of approaches in 71 nations, Salmi observed variations in the groups that are defined and measured across nations. He concluded that higher education outcomes are commonly measured for groups based on gender, SES, income, racial ethnic minority status, and disability status. He also identified groups that are less commonly measured. These include first generation to college, LGBT, victims of sexual abuse and violence, and others that are shown here. In the U.S., definitions of equity tend to emphasize those in the first column: gender, SES, income, race, ethnicity. In my work, I also try to recognize how important it is to be paying attention to the characteristics of places that people live, given the structural inequality across communities and schools and things like that. Simon mentioned inequality in higher education opportunity and outcomes in the U.S. and in other nations. This slide shows just one picture of the differences across groups in the U.S. So these data also come from the U.S. Department of Education, and this is a longitudinal data set. Only 15% of students who were in the lowest SES quartile in the 10th grade earned at least a bachelor's degree within 8 years of high school graduation. By comparison, 60% of students who were in the highest SES quartile reached this level of attainment. This pattern of differential access and success in higher education by SES plays out across nations. Also, as in other nations, in the U.S. we see differences across equity groups in all aspects of the path into and through higher education. This is just another example. So here we see trends in the percentage of high school graduates who enroll in some type of post-secondary education by family income. The upward trend shows that improvements in college enrollment rates generally for all groups, but especially those in the lowest two family income quintiles. But at the same time, we're not making much progress in closing the gaps. So even with the improvements, enrollment rates continue to be about 20 percentage points lower for students in the lowest family income quintile than students in the highest family income quintile. Another essential aspect of addressing equity is reducing the stratification in the type of post-secondary institution that students attend. In the US, we have many different options in terms of higher education. The bottom line shows enrollment at the most selective institutions, so the most elite institutions. Only 16% of students who would be defined as low income, using the measure we have available here, so only 16% of students at the most selective institutions would qualify as low income. And you can see that line is relatively flat over time. We're not making any progress in increasing that representation. As you go up the lines, those represent increasingly less selective institutions. The highest line is for the for-profit institutions, and at those institutions, 74% of the students are low income. This difference in college enrollment is important for many reasons, one of which is completion rates. So completion rates are quite high for the institutions at the lowest level here, and they get less good as you go up the lines. Also important is recognizing the compounded challenges for students who are in more than one equity group. This is data from yet another survey from the Department of Education. Only 21% of students who enrolled in college and were both low income and first in their families to go to college completed a bachelor's degree within 6 years of enrolling. This is lower than the share of students who were only first generation or only low income, and considerably lower than the share of students who were neither low income nor first generation. Our definition of equity should also recognize the demographic characteristics of a population. So in the US, an important issue is the increasing racial ethnic diversity of the population. The blue area in this chart shows the share of high school graduates who are white. This area, hopefully you can see, is becoming smaller over time. At the same time, the share of the graph here that's green, this represents Hispanics, that share of the total is getting larger. At the same time, Hispanics, as well as blacks, continue to be underrepresented in and underserved by our nation's higher education systems. Here you can see the dramatic differences in bachelor's degree attainment by gender and race. So for all four racial ethnic groups shown here, bachelor's degree attainment rates are higher for women than for men, and I know this is true in some other nations as well. Within gender groups, bachelor's degree attainment rates are considerably lower for Hispanic and blacks than for whites and Asians. In short, there's clearly much more that has to be done to close equity gaps in higher education opportunity and outcomes in the US. Many other scholars in nations across the world are also examining how to improve equity in higher education. Earlier this year, the Boston College Center for International Higher Education published an international brief for higher education leaders. This is just one example of some of the cross-national work that's going on. Sergey and Ekaterina Shibanova of HSC contributed a very useful brief to this report, and it has useful insights about the availability and accessibility of higher education in Russia. Another recent report published this time last year describes and characterizes higher education equity policies in 71 nations. In this report, Jamil Salmi draws on survey data to identify the extent to which higher education equity is referenced in national policy documents, looks at the targets for access and success that are specified for particular groups, and looks at the strategies that nations have established to improve equity and success in higher education. One key finding is that too often, improving equity in higher education is little more than a stated policy goal. Salmi writes, quote, "A number of countries are still paying only lip service to the equity agenda." The report classifies nations into 4 groups based on their strategies for improving equity in higher education. As you can see here, most of the nations that were examined are characterized as developing or established. Only 6 nations are identified as advanced. Salmi defines advanced as having a comprehensive equity promotion strategy. SALMI offers this framework as a mechanism for identifying benchmark nations. Cross-national comparisons offer tremendous learning opportunities. Through teaching and research projects, I have been very fortunate to learn a little bit about equity in higher education in nations other than the US, like China, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Hungary, and Kazakhstan. With each of these opportunities, I've gained insights that have advanced my thinking about the forces that contribute to equity in higher education in the US. Nonetheless, identifying lessons that can be transferred across nations is not simple. Nations vary in many characteristics that influence higher education equity. They vary in size and characteristics of the population. They vary in wealth and characteristics of their economies. They vary in the characteristics of their higher education systems. Different nations make different types of higher education options available, and they have established different types of equity-oriented policies. They also have different structures for higher education governance and finance. With that being said, with the goal of advancing understanding of what we may learn from other nations to improve equity, I'd like to share with you a framework that Joni Finney and I developed from an analysis of US states. As Simon mentioned, having a guiding conceptual framework is key to identifying insights that are transferable across contexts. In many ways, individual US states are similar to nations. This slide shows, similar to nations. In the US, the federal government plays a role in encouraging higher education attainment, primarily by providing student financial aid, as well as supporting some other programs that support particular institutions for a particular group and some particular groups of students. But in the US, states have primary responsibility for promoting the educational attainment of their residents. Each US has its own system of higher education with its own structures for higher education governance and finance. Educational attainment also varies dramatically across US states. On average, 32% of adults in the US have earned at least a bachelor's degree, but clearly attention only to the average masks the great differences. So at the high end of the continuum is Massachusetts, with 42% of adults having at least a bachelor's degree. And at the low end, 20% of adults in West Virginia have at least a bachelor's degree. In our book, Joni Finney and I capitalize on these and other differences across states to try to better understand what the role of state policy is in contributing to a state's overall level of attainment, as well as how state policy contributes to differences in equity groups within a state. And really, this builds on our earlier discussion of human capital. So the assumption here is that it's from a public sector theory of economics. Public policy has a role in correcting market failures, and public policy has a role in increasing participation in order to capture and maximize some of the public benefits. For our study, we selected 5 states. 3 of those states have educational attainment that's higher than the national average: Maryland, Washington, and Illinois. And 2 have educational attainment that's below the average: Georgia and Texas. The states are geographically diverse: 1 on the west, 1 in the middle, 1 in the south, 2 in the south actually, and 1 in the northeast. They also vary in many other ways that make cross-state analysis very useful. We use traditional case study methods to do this work. We review documents and reports. We conducted a number of interviews with various stakeholders. And we first produced individual state reports. I won't go into the details of those in the interest of time, but hopefully you can get a sense that our emphasis was on trying to identify how to improve equity. And there were also dramatic differences across the 5 states. Each story is quite unique. And while it's important to recognize those individual stories, we were also trying to identify some themes and conclusions that could be drawn across our 5 states, as well as to look at some findings that might apply more generally. So this slide shows the emerging conceptual model from our work. The model reflects notions of higher education that are particular to the U.S. In the U.S., the role of the market is very important, and also institutional autonomy is a core value of higher education in the U.S. At the foundation of our model is recognition of the state-specific context. The particular types of policies and practices that will improve equity in higher education attainment in a given state will depend on the demographic, the economic, the political, and historical characteristics of that state. The three small circles represent categories of policies that emerge from our analyses. Given differences across states and contextual characteristics, we didn't try to identify specific policies that a state had to implement in order to improve equity. In fact, we try to stress that there's not one single thing that can be done in order to make a difference on these issues. Instead, we point to categories of policies, noting that together the policies in these groups hopefully can be oriented towards improving equity. So one of these categories is what we call here the strategic use of fiscal resources. And this is really the ways in which different policies at the government and institutional level come together to improve college affordability. The second category of policies is called here academic preparation and movement of students. And really what this gets at is the ways in which our systems and structures enable people to move from secondary school into higher education without losing credit. And similarly, in the US, many students enter one institution and then move to another. And so what are the policies and practices that enable that type of movement? And then the third category of policies we call optimization of system capacity. But really this is around policies that ensure the availability and accessibility of high quality higher education options. Under those three circles is a light blue circle, and we label it state policy, leadership, and steering. This circle represents another key finding from our study, the potential role of state policy leadership in steering higher education institutions to act in ways that advance statewide goals. What we were talking about earlier is the public good. We consider improving equity to be one of those public purposes. Higher education institutions have many goals and priorities. Only some of those may be oriented towards improving equity. Simon was raising the potential negative consequences of attention to world-class university status. In our study in Texas, this was a similar type of finding. So we raised questions about the extent to which the state can simultaneously achieve the goals of its master plan, and the master plan was called Closing the Gaps, while also trying to have increased status and reputation for its research universities. A final point about this model, so note the arrows that are leading from educational attainment back through assessment and then back to policies. What we're trying to depict here is that this is not a one-time process. This is ongoing, iterative nature of the policy of improving equity and attainment. Many of the barriers that limit attainment for particular equity groups are deep and systemic. Addressing them will require concerted effort over time. So if our goal is to improve equity, what questions should we be asking to guide the development and implementation of equity-oriented policies and practices? Policies are continuing to be developed. As researchers, I believe it's our obligation to probe these policies and consider the extent to which these policies may or may not be contributing to equity, diversity, and inclusion. One current example in the US is free college. It's also known by other names as free tuition, college promise, debt-free college. This is an initiative that's being proposed by candidates for the US presidential election. At least 17 states have adopted free college policies. And as suggested in this slide, many local communities have also tried to establish a free college policy for their particular community college or four-year institution. I recognize that some nations have long had free college, but with the goal of encouraging us as a community to think about how we can contribute to knowledge about the impact of policies for equity, I'd like to share some information about my team's work on trying to understand these policies. So over the past 4 years, we've sought to address these 5 questions. So the first is conceptual. How or why might these programs improve higher education access and success? What are the characteristics of the programs that are being implemented? What are meaningful groups of programs? What are the effects of these programs on college-related outcomes? And how are programs being designed and implemented within particular contexts? So the first question, again, is conceptual. And I'm going to go back to human capital theory, so there's nice synergies from our talks this morning. So I start at this from the perspective of a human capital theory, that students make decisions about enrolling and persisting in college based on their perceptions of the benefits and the costs. They'll enroll if they perceive the benefits to exceed the costs. Human capital theory assumes that students calculate the benefits based on their perceptions of their academic readiness to succeed and the likelihood that they'll complete a degree. Students also consider their perceptions of the increase in earnings and other benefits that will come from completing a particular program at a specific institution. Cost calculations are based on their perceptions of their ability to pay. Students calculate their ability to pay based on their perceptions of their own income and perhaps their family's income and other financial resources, as well as their understanding of the cost of attention. And through that discussion, I've really emphasized perceptions and understandings. Human capital theory does not assume that people have perfect or complete information. The theory only assumes that students are acting rationally if they use the information that they have. Consistent with human capital theory, we know from research that there are really 3 primary requirements that limit and promote college enrollment in the U.S. The first is the academic readiness to meet college-level expectations. The second is the financial resources to pay the costs. And the third is information. And information is really important given the number of higher education options and the complexity of the finance system in the U.S. But human capital theory, I would argue, is not enough for our understanding of what really makes a difference for college enrollment. Drawing from sociological perspectives, we've also learned that students don't make their decisions in a vacuum. Instead, their decisions about higher education are made within and depend on the different contexts that they're embedded. For instance, whether a student aspires to enroll in higher education and knows how to navigate related processes is likely influenced by the knowledge and experiences of their other family members and the college-going norms of their communities and schools. As in other nations, access to higher education in the U.S. is linked to equity in secondary education. Whether a student is academically prepared for college depends on the courses that are being offered in their secondary schools. Academic readiness also depends on public policies that determine academic requirements for graduating from high school. And whether an individual persists to degree completion is influenced by the resources that are available at the higher education institution that a student attends. In short, some like to point to student agency with regard to student access and success, but really, more important, I would argue, are the structures and systems that promote or limit higher education opportunity for people in particular communities, attending particular schools, and living in particular states and nations. So given what we know from theory and research, how might free college improve equity? So there are 3 elements of these programs that could be beneficial. They could provide a financial award that reduces the cost of college They could provide a clear, simple message that college is affordable, and they could be designed to address some of these other barriers that limit college access and success. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of why each of those things is important from the U.S. context. So in the U.S., college cost has become a really important issue. Cost of attendance is rising faster than family income. Rates of borrowing are increasing. The average amount of loans borrowed is also increasing. And loans are playing out differently across equity groups. So rates of using loans and the amount of loans that are taken up is higher for blacks than it is for students of other racial ethnic groups. And then another aspect of paying for college costs that really has to do with some of this aspect of the engagement in the college experience has to do with other mechanisms students are using to pay college costs, like working for pay while they're enrolled. As I alluded to, addressing information barriers is very important in the U.S. context. There are challenges with learning how much it will actually cost an individual student to go to college. One reason for this challenge is that student financial aid is allocated to students in many different types of ways based on financial criteria as well as some academic achievement criteria. It's not transparent to students in advance how much aid they will receive in advance. The process of applying for financial aid is also quite complex. Adding on to that, there are insufficient numbers of counselors in the secondary schools that students attend to help people understand how to navigate our systems. Okay, so the second question that we're examining in our study of free college is really, what are these programs? So there have been quite a large number of programs that have come up in the past several years. It's been really quite astonishing that the numbers of programs. But to address this issue, my team and I have created an online searchable database. And our idea here is to try to bring order to the variety of programs here and develop a shared understanding of what we mean when we say free college. Our efforts underscore the need to pay attention to program characteristics. One finding is, for example, that we have programs that have similar names but have very different design characteristics. And we have programs that have very similar design features but have different names. So building on this database, a third step has been to try to identify meaningful categories of programs. Identifying categories of programs, we believe, is the first step to understanding whether research on one particular program will be transferred to another. And here from our analysis, we have 7 different types of programs that have emerged. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into this, but really the idea is to think about how we proceed through the complex world of doing policy-oriented research. The fourth question that we're trying to understand is, what do we know about the effects of programs with different designs? So the research is still emerging. Many of these programs are quite new, and so when data are available, we have data only on their effects on college enrollment. Most of what we know about these types of programs is based on a very particular type of model, the place-based scholarship programs. But in an effort to generate research, I have a forthcoming edited volume that looks at some of these different models. And hopefully, this gives you a sense of just how much diversity there is in approaches. So we have programs that are focused on urban communities. We have a program focused on one urban school district. There are state-level programs. There are programs focused on communities within a state. And then there are programs focused at particular institutions. Finally, the final question that is really emerging for us as increasingly important is paying attention not just to what the stated characteristics of a program are, but actually how are they being designed and implemented within particular contexts. So to address this question, we're conducting case studies of 4 programs that offer free tuition to attend a particular community college. This research is being conducted in collaboration with Research for Action and with financial support from the Gates Foundation. One conclusion is clear: whether the programs will improve equity depends on program design and implementation. And so I'll just give you briefly a few aspects of program design that are important. So whether and how programs address the financial barriers to college attention varies dramatically. So some programs cover only a portion of the total cost of attendance, like tuition, but going to college has other costs as well. Whether a program improves equity will also depend on eligibility criteria. So who gets the benefit? When we examine programs with an equity lens, we have to consider questions like, is the program targeted to low-income students? What do students have to do to get the benefits? Do the requirements of programs encourage students to engage in outcomes that does the program encourage students to engage in behaviors that improve their outcomes? Or do eligibility requirements serve to exclude some from participation? A seemingly clear message of free college could be beneficial. It could be a potential benefit of these programs. But whether this message actually makes a difference for improving college opportunity depends on what the message is in individual communities and how the message is being interpreted by students, parents, counselors, and others. Programs could be designed and implemented to ease the transition into and from secondary school into higher education. And a subgroup of programs does seem to be implemented to achieve these goals. We should be asking questions about the extent to which programs have mechanisms to try to address some of these transition issues. And as I mentioned, many programs limit the use of the financial award to students attending a particular institution. As such, it's important to consider the resources that are available at the institutions that we encourage students to attend. Will students from different equity groups who enroll at these institutions have the support that they need to persist to degree completion? Finally, in order for a program to improve equity, it has to be sustainable. In our case studies, we're finding that developing a program that is financially sustainable is a high priority for program designers. This interest, in turn, is influencing program design, including the amount of the financial award and the number of characteristics of students who receive it. The longer-term financial costs of a program will also be influenced by changes in program eligibility, as well as increases in the cost of attendance that a program covers. Financial sustainability depends on the source of the funding. We're finding programs that are funded by state governments, by endowments, and by private philanthropy. The short-term and long-term implications of different funding streams should also be considered. And then political sustainability also matters. It influences financial sustainability and other program characteristics. Political sustainability is likely influenced by program leadership, and political support for a program may vary based on the characteristics of the population served. So in conclusion, to improve equity in higher education opportunity and outcomes, we need more than rhetoric that equity, diversity, and inclusion are important. We need actions that address the systemic and structural barriers to college opportunity. These actions can take the form of public policies, like federal, state, and local policies, and they can also take the form of policies and practices of higher education systems and institutions. I hope that the information I presented is helpful in thinking about how we in our various institutions and nations can better understand how to improve equity in higher education. Especially important is attention to how we define and measure equity, the conceptual frameworks that we use to understand the problem and examine potential solutions, and the equity-oriented questions that we ask about potential solutions. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much, and especially thank you for being brief. I'm very sorry for saying this, but still we have only time for 2 or maximum 2 questions, so or comments, but really brief. So please, who want to ask question to Laura's presentation. I can see.
Можно мне?
Yes.
Спасибо большое. То есть,
One moment, just for...
да, спасибо. То есть, ну, мы все понимаем, что образования бесплатного не бывает, только вопрос плательщика, то есть кто платит и где, на каком уровне и как это выстраивается. Вот говоря о снятии барьеров или возможности как-то посмотреть на те, вы говорили об этом, когда все-таки плательщиком являются муниципалитеты, являются субъекты или там штаты, вот предусматриваются ли или включаются ли в расчет такого рода компенсации или инструменты, как снятие налоговых ограничений, налоговые льготы. Вот у нас есть льготы по подоходному налогу. Там у нас есть пример, где Санкт-Петербург, например, снял налог на землю и на имущество с университетов. И, наверное, тоже этот инструмент должен рассматривать как, ну, инструмент какого-то, в общем, воздействия. Поэтому вот, если можно, вот в этой части. Спасибо большое, Лора, да, хороший доклад, спасибо.
Thank you very much. Very helpful comments, and we could spend a long time talking about these issues. A few words. So when I said free college, so an important clarification. So I was speaking of how the programs are being presented to students, which is free to the student, but of course someone has to pay the costs. And figuring out how to pay the costs is a very, very important issue. There are programs are being proposed with different mechanisms to pay costs. Some are going to be funded by state government appropriations. Some are paid by local government appropriations. Some are being paid by private donors. And you know, as you're suggesting, the stability of those different sources varies over time. And we've even seen one program in the US that was funded by state government. The funding is less than anticipated, and so now they've made it a less generous award. It's targeted to more academically achieving students now, so fewer students are getting the benefit, and it's less equity oriented, in fact. You know, I appreciate the other questions that you've raised, you know, figuring out how, and I think this builds on, it's a central question for this conference, how we recognize the public benefits of higher education and then identify ways to both provide funding to institutions and then have institutions recognize their obligation within a community as well. Very important issues.